Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Christopher Anderson's phone vibrated against the truck's dashboard at 4:47 p.m., the screen casting pale light across his weathered hands. He'd been parked at the Hoh Rainforest Ranger Station for 20 minutes, engine off, watching rain bead on the windshield. The call was from a number he didn't recognize. Anderson. Mr. Anderson. This is Robert Parker. My son. The voice cracked, reformed. They said you were the best. They said if anyone could find him, it would be you. Chris closed his eyes. Through the phone, he could hear the particular species of panic that came from a parent whose child had been missing too long. He'd heard it before, in another forest, another life. Tell me about your son, Mr. Parker. Ethan, 17. He's with his school group. Was with them. Junior class camping trip. They've been looking for 8 hours. Robert Parker's words came faster now, tumbling over each other. The other rangers, they're good people, but they keep saying things like grid search and probability zones, and I need someone who understands that my boy is out there right now, getting colder, getting scared. Mr. Parker. Chris kept his voice level, professional. I'm going to find your son, but I need you to slow down and give me the details. The rain intensified, drumming against the truck's roof. Chris grabbed a notepad from the glove compartment. Not the department-issued tablet, but actual paper, because batteries died and screens cracked, and sometimes the old ways worked better. Ethan Parker, 5'9", 140 pounds. Last seen at 8:30 a.m. on the Hoh River Trail, approximately 3 miles from the trailhead. Wearing a red North Face jacket, blue jeans, hiking boots. The group had stopped for a water break. When the teacher did a head count 10 minutes later, Ethan was gone. No answer when they called his name. No response to whistle signals. The Park Service has 6 rangers searching, Robert said. But you've done this before. In Montana, they said. You found that girl when everyone else had given up. Chris's hand tightened on the phone. I'll be at the command post in 15 minutes. He didn't mention that the girl in Montana had been found too late. Didn't mention the 3 days he'd spent in psychiatric evaluation afterward, trying to explain to doctors what he'd seen in those woods. Didn't mention that he'd requested a transfer to Washington specifically because Olympic National Park was 3 states away from those memories. The command post was a circus of organized chaos. 2 SAR volunteers huddled over a topographic map spread across a folding table, marking grid sectors with red grease pencil. A K9 handler worked with a German Shepherd near the trailhead, letting the dog sniff a t-shirt sealed in a plastic bag. Park Superintendent Jennifer Walsh stood apart from the others, radio pressed to her ear, her face tight with the kind of stress that came from knowing the first 24 hours were critical, and 8 of them were already gone. She saw Chris approaching and ended her radio call mid-sentence. Anderson. Thank God. She met him halfway, lowering her voice. Parker's father called you directly? He did. The family's connected. Robert Parker served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He has friends in high places, and they've been calling my office every 30 minutes. Walsh's exhaustion showed in the slight tremor of her hand as she pushed back her hood. I'm not asking you to work miracles, I'm asking you to do what you do. What he did. Chris wasn't sure anymore what that meant. Once it had meant tracking, survival skills, an almost preternatural ability to think like lost people thought, to follow the invisible threads that led them astray. But after Montana, after seeing things that shouldn't exist outside of fever dreams, he wasn't sure if his instincts were gifts or symptoms. Show me what you got. The map told a story of systematic failure. 6 rangers had covered the obvious routes. The main trail, the river access points, the designated campsites. The K9 unit had lost Ethan's scent at a fallen cedar log 2.5 miles in, which made no sense unless the boy had been carried from that point. But there were no signs of struggle, No broken branches or disturbed soil that would indicate someone hauling a 140-pound teenager through dense forest. "Weather's turning," Walsh said, pointing to the darkening western sky. "Temperature's dropping fast. We've got maybe 2 hours of decent light left." Chris studied the map, his finger tracing the contour lines. The Hoh River Trail followed the valley floor, but there were dozens of game trails branching off into the old-growth forest. A disoriented kid could wander into that maze and walk in circles for days. The trees here grew so thick that sunlight barely penetrated, moss hanging from branches in curtains of green that absorbed sound and turned the forest into a cathedral of silence. "Did anyone check the Spider Lake route?" Walsh frowned. "That's off trail. Kid would have to deliberately leave the marked path. So would be the case for half the places you've already searched." Chris tapped a ridgeline north of the main trail. "If I'm 17 and want to impress my friends, I'm not sticking to the baby trail. I'm going somewhere interesting." "The Spider Lake area." Walsh hesitated. "We've had problems there before." "What kind of problems?" 3 years ago, a hiker reported hearing voices. Thought someone was in distress, followed the sound for 2 hours. Nearly died of exposure before we found him. Said the voices led him in circles. Walsh's expression was carefully neutral. "Then last year, a couple camping near Spider Creek both reported nightmares. Same nightmare, same night. They packed up at dawn and refused to tell us what they'd dreamed about." Chris felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And you didn't think this was relevant to brief the search teams?" "Because it sounds crazy, Anderson, and we don't make search decisions based on campfire stories." But Chris knew better than most that crazy and impossible weren't always synonyms. He grabbed a handheld GPS unit from the equipment table and checked the battery. 78%. His pack was already loaded. First aid kit, emergency blanket, water filter, rope, headlamp, extra batteries. The Motorola radio on his belt crackled with periodic check-ins from the search teams. All negative. No signs of Ethan Parker. "I'm going to Spider Lake," Chris said. Walsh nodded slowly. "Radio check every 30 minutes. If I don't hear from you by nightfall, I'm pulling you out." "Understood." "And Anderson?" She lowered her voice. "I read your file. I know what happened in Montana. If you start feeling off, I need you to turn back immediately. No heroics." Chris didn't answer. He adjusted his pack straps and headed for the trailhead. The Hoh rainforest lived up to its name. Rain filtered through the canopy in a steady drizzle that never quite became a downpour but never stopped. Within minutes, Chris's jacket was dark with moisture. The trail was a ribbon of mud winding between Sitka spruce and western hemlock, some of them over 300 feet tall and wide enough that it would take 4 people joining hands to circle their trunks. Moss covered everything, branches, fallen logs, even the rocks in the river, creating an ecosystem that seemed more underwater than terrestrial. Chris moved quickly but carefully, his eyes scanning for any sign of passage. At the 2-mile mark, he left the maintained trail and pushed into the understory. Here the forest became something else entirely. The canopy closed overhead, reducing daylight to a greenish twilight. Sounds changed too. The distant rush of the Hoh River faded to a whisper, replaced by the drip, drip, drip of condensation and the occasional crack of a branch settling. His radio crackled. "Command to Anderson. Radio check." "Anderson here. 2.3 miles in, heading north-northwest toward Spider Lake drainage. No signs yet." "Copy that. Weather update. Front moving in faster than predicted. We're looking at heavy rain by 1900 hours." Chris clicked acknowledgement and kept moving. The GPS showed him as a blue dot on a screen otherwise empty of trails or landmarks. He was navigating by topography now, following the subtle rise and fall of the land, using the moss patterns on trees to maintain his bearing. North-facing sides grew thicker moss, an old woodsman's trick that worked until it didn't, until you found yourself somewhere deep enough that the usual rules bent. At 3.7 miles, he found the first anomaly. A hemlock sapling, maybe 8 feet tall, had been stripped of its bark in a perfect spiral from base to crown. The exposed wood underneath was pale, almost luminescent in the dim light. Chris knelt beside it, running his fingers over the smooth surface. No tool marks, No sign of animal activity, just bare wood spiraling upward like a barber's pole. He keyed his radio. Anderson to command. Found something unusual. Tree stripped in a helical pattern. Deliberate, not natural. Static, then Walsh's voice. Could be elk rubbing, it's rut season. Negative, patterns too clean, too intentional. A pause. Mark the location and continue. Let me know if you find more. Chris used his knife to blaze the tree, a simple X cut into the bark at eye level, and moved on. The forest seemed to press closer now, the spacing between trees tightening. He checked his compass, bearing 342 degrees, still generally north. But something felt wrong. The quality of light had changed, becoming flatter, directionless. He looked up and saw nothing but green canopy, no hint of sky. The second anomaly appeared 50 yards later, a circle of stones, each about the size of a soccer ball, arranged in a perfect ring around a nurse log. The log itself was massive, a fallen giant that must have been 6 feet in diameter before it toppled. Ferns and saplings grew from its decomposing mass, but the stones, Chris counted 13, formed a boundary that nothing had crossed. No ferns, no moss, no seedlings, just bare mineral soil inside the ring. He photographed it with his phone, though the image came out strangely dark, the stones appearing almost black against the forest floor. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to chalk this up to some quirk of geology or ecology that had a perfectly rational explanation he simply didn't know. But Ethan Parker was somewhere out here, and rational explanations wouldn't keep a 17-year-old alive through a cold October night. Anderson to command. Found a stone circle approximately 8 feet in diameter, 13 stones. Appears ceremonial. Another pause, longer this time. Anderson, are you suggesting indigenous artifacts? Because that changes our... I'm suggesting I don't know what the hell this is. Chris heard the edge in his own voice and forced himself to breathe. Continuing to Spider Lake. He stepped over the stone circle, careful not to disturb it, and immediately wished he hadn't. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the span of 3 steps. His breath became visible, fog pluming in air that moments before had been merely cool. The dripping sounds stopped. Even the rain seemed to pause, droplets hanging suspended in the air like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then he heard it. Chris. His name, spoken in a voice he recognized instantly. A voice that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, because its owner had been dead for 3 years. Sarah Mitchell, the girl from Montana, the one he'd found too late. If this story is capturing your attention, follow for more quality content. What would you do in Christopher's situation? Trust your instincts or trust your training? Share your thoughts. Chris spun, hand moving to the canister of bear spray on his belt, even though he knew bear spray wouldn't help with this. The forest looked the same in every direction. Endless corridors of moss-draped trees, shadows pooling between trunks, the greenish twilight that made distance impossible to judge. Chris, I'm cold. The voice came from his left now, maybe 20 yards away. It had the flat quality of someone speaking through a wall, slightly muffled but unmistakably Sarah's voice. He remembered it with terrible clarity. A 13-year-old girl with braces and a Seahawks hoodie, last seen arguing with her parents at a Montana trailhead. He'd found her 4 days later in a hollow beneath an overturned pine, hypothermic and unresponsive. She'd died in the medevac helicopter, whispering about a man in the trees who wouldn't stop calling her name. Chris had spent 3 days after that in a hospital, telling psychiatrists about the figure he'd glimpsed in the forest. Tall, impossibly thin, moving between trees in ways that defied perspective. They diagnosed him with acute stress reaction, prescribed medication, and recommended a transfer. He'd taken the transfer but thrown away the pills. "You're not real," he said to the empty forest. "Why did you leave me, Chris?" Sarah's voice, smaller now, younger. "I waited for you. I'm still waiting." His hand shook as he pulled out the radio. "Anderson to command, He stopped. What could he say? That he was hearing ghosts? That the forest was speaking to him in the voice of a dead child? Walsh would pull him out immediately, and Ethan Parker would spend the night alone in these woods. Disregard, continuing search, he forced himself to move forward, each step deliberate. The GPS showed him still tracking north, approaching the Spider Lake drainage. Elevation 1,047 feet, bearing 338 degrees. Numbers and data, concrete things to hold on to while reality frayed at the edges. The trees began to change. Their bark turned darker, almost black in places, and the moss grew in strange patterns, geometric shapes that reminded Chris of circuit boards or alien languages. He'd seen forests across the western United States, from California redwoods to Alaska's taiga, and he'd never seen anything like this. It was as if the forest was becoming something other than forest, transforming into a space that followed different rules. "Ethan," Chris called, his voice swallowed by the dense air. "Ethan Parker, can you hear me?" No response. Just the resumed drip, drip, drip of rain and the whisper of wind through branches that didn't move. He found the third anomaly at the edge of Spider Creek. Ethan's red North Face jacket, folded neatly on a flat boulder beside the water. Not discarded in panic, not torn from a struggle, but placed deliberately, sleeves aligned, hood smoothed flat. Chris approached slowly, every instinct screaming trap. He checked the area for tracks, for any sign of how the jacket had arrived here. Nothing. The creek bank was soft soil, perfect for footprints, but showed no disturbance. He keyed his radio. "Command, I've got Ethan's jacket. Spider Creek, approximately 4.1 miles from Trailhead." He read off the GPS coordinates. No sign of the boy himself. Walsh's voice came back tight with controlled urgency. "Is there blood? Any indication of injury?" Chris lifted the jacket, carefully checking the fabric. Negative, it's clean, dry, folded. He paused. "Superintendent, something's very wrong here." Define wrong. How to explain? The impossible cold, the voices, the way the forest seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence. The jacket was placed here, not dropped, not lost. Someone or something arranged it. Are you suggesting abduction? I'm suggesting we're not dealing with a lost hiker scenario. A long silence, filled with static and the distant sound of Walsh consulting with others. Finally, "Anderson, I'm sending backup your way. Johnson and Martinez are en route to your position. ETA 45 minutes, do not proceed alone." That's 45 minutes Ethan doesn't have. That's a direct order, Ranger. Hold position and wait for... Chris turned off the radio. He knew he'd pay for it later. Probably lose his job. Definitely face disciplinary action. But he also knew with absolute certainty that Ethan Parker was close, that the boy was still alive, and that conventional search and rescue protocols wouldn't reach him in time. Whatever lived in these woods operated by different rules, and Chris had encountered those rules before. He left the jacket on the boulder and followed Spider Creek upstream. The water ran black, reflecting nothing, its surface smooth as glass despite flowing over rocks. Unnatural. Everything here was unnatural, from the geometric moss patterns to the temperature gradient that put frost on ferns while rain still fell. He was walking deeper into something that shouldn't exist, and every cell in his body screamed at him to turn back. "Chris, help me." Sarah's voice again, directly ahead now. Not from the trees, but from the creek itself, as if the water had learned to speak. Chris pulled his flashlight despite the remaining daylight, needing its solid beam to prove the world was still made of matter and light. "You're not Sarah," he said aloud. "Sarah is dead. So is Ethan. So are you. We're all dead here, Chris. This is where dead things come to grow." The beam of his flashlight caught something in the water, pale, elongated, moving with the current, but not like debris. More like fingers, reaching up through the black surface. Chris jerked the light away, his heart hammering. Not real. Stress hallucination. Acute anxiety brought on by trauma and exhaustion. All the explanations his Montana psychiatrist had given him. Neat clinical terms for the brain's refusal to process impossible events. But the fingers remained at the edge of his vision, beckoning. He climbed a rise beside the creek, using exposed roots as handholds. The forest opened slightly here, revealing a small clearing perhaps 30 feet across. In the center stood a western red cedar, ancient and massive, its bark scarred with what looked like claw marks. No, not claw marks. Letters, carved deep into the wood, weathered but still legible. Turn back. Feed the voice. Leave offering, save yourself. The words spiraled up the trunk, dozens of warnings in different handwriting, different languages. Chris recognized English, Spanish, what might have been French or Portuguese. Some of the carvings looked decades old, the wood healed around them. Others were fresh, sap still weeping from cut bark. His hands trembled as he added his own message with his knife. Ethan Parker, 10/18/2018. Why do you keep fighting, Chris? The voice wasn't Sarah's anymore. It had shifted, become something older and stranger, a sound like wind through hollow trees. Chris turned slowly, flashlight raised. There was nothing behind him, nothing in the clearing. But the tree, the ancient cedar with its spiral of warnings, was different. The bark rippled, patterns flowing like water, and for just a moment Chris saw faces in the grain, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pressed against the wood from inside as if the tree contained multitudes. Every year someone comes, the voice said. Every year they bring me what I need. A hiker who wanders too far, a camper who hears the call. They feed me their warmth, their breath, their precious certainty that they exist. And I grow stronger. Chris backed away from the tree, his flashlight beam shaking. Where's Ethan? Closer than you think. Farther than you can reach. A sound like laughter, dry leaves rustling. He heard me calling with his mother's voice. She's been dead 2 years. Cancer. Very sad. And he misses her so much it makes a hole inside him. I fill holes, Chris. I fill all the empty places. Let him go. Why would I do that? He's mine now. Just like you're mine. Just like everyone who enters my woods belongs to me eventually. The patterns in the bark intensified, faces pressing outward, mouths opening in silent screams. I am the space between thoughts, the doubt that creeps in during long nights, the voice that sounds like someone you've lost. I've been here since before the loggers, before the rangers, before the humans gave these trees names, and I'll be here long after you're gone. Chris's mind raced, trying to find logic in madness. The thing, entity, spirit, whatever it was, fed on people. Not their bodies, but something else. Their warmth, it had said. Their breath. Their certainty. You took Sarah Mitchell, Chris said. Sweet girl. She lasted 3 days before she let go. You found the shell, but I kept the part that mattered. And now you want Ethan. I already have him. He's been mine since dawn. Walking in circles, hearing his mother getting colder and weaker with each hour. By now he's barely conscious. By midnight he'll cross over completely. Then why are you talking to me? The laughter came again, louder. Because you're different, Chris. You saw me in Montana. You looked right at me, and instead of dismissing what you saw, you believed. That belief opened a door. You've been feeding me ever since, haven't you? Every doubt, every nightmare, every moment you questioned your own sanity. Delicious. Chris felt the truth of it settle like ice in his chest. The sleepless nights, the paranoia, the constant second-guessing of his own perceptions, all of it had been a slow feast for this thing. By surviving his encounter in Montana, he'd condemned himself to a different kind of consumption. What do you want? He asked. Trade. That's how it's always worked. The old peoples knew. You can't take from my woods without giving something in return. One life for another. Walk away now and I release Ethan. Stay, and you both feed me until there's nothing left. You're lying. You won't release him. No, the voice agreed. Probably not. But it's a better offer than you'll get otherwise. Chris's radio crackled to life despite being turned off. Walsh's voice came through, distorted. Anderson, your position. Martinez and Johnson. Can't find, following your blazes, but keep disappearing. The entity was isolating him, cutting him off from help. Standard predator behavior. Separate the prey from the herd. But Chris had one advantage. He'd been here before. Not physically, but mentally. In Montana, he'd walked to the edge of sanity and looked over. He knew what this kind of terror felt like, knew how it worked on the mind. Knowledge wasn't much of a weapon, but it was what he had. "Show me Ethan," Chris said. "Prove he's still alive." The cedar tree shuddered, and one of the faces in the bark opened its eyes. Actual eyes, human and terrified. Ethan Parker's face, pressed against the wood from inside, mouth working soundlessly. Chris lunged forward, but the vision flickered and vanished, leaving only weathered bark. "You see? He's comfortable, safe. More safe than he'd be with you, stumbling through the dark, hypothermic, dying by degrees. I keep my collection preserved. They don't feel cold anymore. Don't feel anything. That's not living. Neither is what you're doing, Chris. Running from forests to forests, haunted by memories, poisoning yourself with guilt. You're already mine. You just haven't admitted it yet." Chris closed his eyes, forcing himself to think. The entity fed on certainty, on the conviction that reality was solid, that death was final, that lost children stayed lost. It filled the gaps left by doubt and despair. But it had made a mistake by engaging with him, by offering conversation. Predators that talked were predators that could be negotiated with, manipulated, possibly even trapped. He opened his eyes and looked at the tree. "You said the old peoples knew, the ones who lived here before. They had a way to bind you, didn't they? That's what the stone circles are, containment." Silence. The patterns in the bark slowed. "The warnings on the tree," Chris continued, his mind working faster now. "Different languages, different years. You've been contained before. Multiple times. Someone keeps finding you, binding you, forcing you back into dormancy. And then the bindings weaken, and you wake up, and the cycle starts again." Clever ranger. The voice had lost some of its certainty, but knowledge doesn't save you. The circles are ancient, and I've learned to work around them. The one who bound me last died 15 years ago. There's no one left who remembers the words. Chris thought of the stone circle he'd crossed, the boundary that nothing grew past. A containment barrier broken when he'd stepped over it. He'd released the entity from whatever weakened prison still held it. "Then I'll make new words," Chris said. He pulled out his knife and approached the tree. The bark rippled defensively, but Chris placed his palm flat against it, feeling the rough texture, the pulse of something vast and hungry beneath. He began to carve. Not warnings, but something else. A promise. "I, Christopher Anderson, offer a trade. My certainty for Ethan Parker's life. My belief for his freedom. Everything I know to be real, I surrender. In exchange, you return the boy unharmed to his father." That's not how this works. The old peoples made bargains with you. Why else would you honor their circles for centuries? You're bound by rules, by the structure of deals and trades. So here's my deal. Take what you want from me, but give Ethan back. Chris carved deeper, his own blood mixing with the tree's sap. His hands moved with certainty he didn't feel, cutting symbols that came to him from somewhere beyond conscious thought. Maybe from the forest itself, maybe from the collective knowledge of everyone who'd ever faced this entity. Circles within circles, spirals that ended and began in the same place. "You'll lose everything," the voice whispered, and now it sounded almost concerned. "Your memories, your sense of self, your ability to trust your own perceptions. You'll spend the rest of your life wondering what's real. It will be a living death." "Probably," Chris agreed. "But Ethan Parker goes home to his father tonight." The tree shuddered violently. The faces in the bark multiplied, pressing outward, screaming silent protests. The temperature plummeted further, frost spreading across the ground in intricate patterns. Chris kept carving, his fingers numb, blood running down the blade. "Agreed." The word boomed through the clearing, through Chris's bones, through the fabric of the forest itself. The cedar split down its center with a sound like a gunshot, and Ethan Parker tumbled out onto the moss, gasping, alive, his red jacket missing but otherwise unharmed. Chris dropped his knife and ran to the boy, checking for injuries. Ethan's eyes were unfocused, his lips blue, but his pulse was strong. He was hypothermic but savable. "Ethan, can you hear me? I'm Chris. I'm a ranger. Your dad sent me to find you." The boy's eyes found Chris's face. "Mom?" he whispered. "I heard, Mom. That wasn't your mom. But you're safe now. We're going home." Chris pulled the emergency blanket from his pack and wrapped it around Ethan, then keyed his radio. "Command, this is Anderson. I have Ethan Parker, alive. Coordinates." He read off the GPS numbers. "Immediate medevac required. Subject is hypothermic but stable." Walsh's voice came back, clear now, the distortion gone. "Copy that, Anderson. Medevac en route. ETA 12 minutes. You found him?" "I did." "How?" Chris looked back at the cedar tree. It stood whole and unbroken, no sign of the split that had released Ethan. His blood on the bark was gone. The carved symbols had vanished, leaving only the spiral of warnings from previous victims. "Lucky break," Chris said. He lifted Ethan into a fireman's carry and started back toward the main trail. Behind him, he heard the voice one last time, faint as breath. "Our deal is struck, Chris. You'll remember me. Every shadow, every doubt, every moment between sleep and waking. I'm with you now. Forever." Chris kept walking. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if he were carrying more than just a teenage boy. He was carrying the weight of certainty surrendered, of reality negotiated, of a bargain whose terms he didn't fully understand. But Ethan Parker was breathing against his shoulder, and somewhere ahead a father would hold his son again. That would have to be enough. The forest grew lighter as they descended. The geometric moss patterns faded back to ordinary green. The black water of Spider Creek ran clear. By the time they reached the stone circle, it had been disturbed. Stones scattered as if by animals, the boundary broken beyond recognition. Chris didn't look back. The medevac helicopter lifted Ethan away 20 minutes later, its spotlight cutting through the darkness like a blessing. Robert Parker gripped Chris's hand with both of his own, tears streaming down his face, unable to form words. Chris nodded, extracted himself gently, and walked to where Walsh waited beside the command post. "That was reckless," she said. "Turning off your radio, going against direct orders. I should suspend you." "I know. But you found him. Against all odds, you brought that boy home." She studied his face. "What did you see out there, Anderson?" Chris thought about lying, thought about filing a report full of believable details. Lucky tracking, found the boy hypothermic in a hollow, simple rescue. But when he opened his mouth, the truth came out anyway. "I don't know. I'm not sure what was real anymore." Walsh's expression softened. "Get checked out by the medics. Then go home. Sleep. We'll debrief in the morning." But Chris knew he wouldn't sleep. Not tonight, not for many nights to come. He'd traded his certainty for Ethan's life, and the price was only beginning to come due. 3 days later, Chris returned to the Spider Lake area with a GPS unit and a determination to find the cedar tree. He searched for 6 hours, covering every square foot of the drainage. The tree wasn't there. The clearing didn't exist. His GPS showed him walking in circles, doubling back on his own path, moving through space that should have led somewhere but didn't. He found 13 stones arranged in a perfect circle around a nurse log, but when he took photographs, the images came out blank, just gray static, as if the forest refused to be documented. Robert Parker sent a letter. "Ranger Anderson, words can't express what you've done for our family. Ethan is recovering well. The doctors say he has no memory of being lost, which they tell me is common with hypothermia. He asks about you sometimes, says he remembers a man who carried him through the dark. I told him you were the best ranger in the Pacific Northwest. Thank you for bringing my son home. Robert Parker." Chris kept the letter in his wallet. On nights when the doubt became overwhelming, when he questioned whether Ethan had ever been lost at all or if the entire incident was a shared delusion, he'd take it out and read the words. Physical proof. A father's gratitude. Evidence that something good had come from the bargain. But the voice was always there, whispering at the edge of hearing. In the rustle of wind through branches, in the white noise of rain, in the space between heartbeats. I'm with you now. Forever. Chris learned to live with it. He continued working as a ranger, conducting searches, finding lost hikers, bringing people home. But he never claimed certainty again. When someone asked if he thought a particular trail was safe, he'd say probably. When asked if he believed in the supernatural, he'd say, I don't know. When asked if he'd found peace after Montana, he'd smile and change the subject, because the truth was complicated. The truth was that he'd stood at the intersection of possible and impossible and made a choice. The truth was that 17-year-old Ethan Parker got to finish high school, got to go to college, got to have a life because Chris had been willing to surrender his own certainty about reality. Some trades were worth making, even if you paid for them every day afterward. Late one evening in December, Chris received a call from Walsh. There's a situation developing near Lake Quinault. Young couple hasn't checked in from their backpacking trip. They're 2 days overdue. Chris looked out his window at the dark forest beyond. Somewhere in those trees, something old and patient was waiting. But somewhere else, a young couple needed help. I'll head out first thing in the morning. Anderson, Walsh said carefully. Are you sure you're up for this? After everything? No, Chris said honestly. But send me the coordinates anyway. Because that was the bargain. He'd given up his certainty, but he'd kept his purpose. And in the end, maybe that was the only truth that mattered. That some people walked into dark places so others wouldn't have to. That some rangers carried weight others couldn't see. That the forest took and took and took, but occasionally, if you were willing to pay the price, it could be forced to give something back. Chris packed his gear as the winter rain drummed against the roof. Somewhere in the Olympic wilderness, something was calling new victims with familiar voices. And somewhere in that same wilderness, Christopher Anderson would be waiting to make another impossible trade. The forest never forgot. But neither did he. Thank you for reading to the end. If you appreciated this narrative, consider following for more engaging stories. What's your interpretation of Christopher's final bargain? Did he truly encounter something supernatural? Or was it all in his mind? I'd love to hear your theories in the comments. The phone call came at 6:47 a.m., 17 minutes before Christopher Hayes' shift officially started. He stood in the ranger station kitchen, instant coffee dissolving in lukewarm water, when the call transferred from dispatch cut through the morning quiet. Mr. Hayes? The woman's voice fractured on his name. They said you're the best. They said if anyone can find her, it's you. Christopher set down the mug. Through the window, fog pressed against the glass like something trying to get in. Ma'am, I need you to take a breath and tell me. Rachel. My daughter Rachel, she's 16. The school group came back yesterday without her. They're searching, but... The woman's voice dropped to something raw and desperate. She left me a voicemail before her phone died. Mr. Hayes, she said she heard me calling her, but I wasn't there. I wasn't anywhere near that forest. The coffee forgotten, Christopher pulled the incident report up on the computer. Rachel Morrison. Last seen on the Hoh River Trail, 36 hours ago. The official search team had covered the standard grid. Found nothing. They'd resume at first light, expanding the radius. But Christopher knew the radius didn't matter in the Hoh rainforest. Not in the places where the search teams wouldn't go. Not in Sector 7 where the Douglas fir grew. Mrs. Morrison, he said, keeping his voice level, professional. I'll find your daughter. After he hung up, Christopher stood motionless, staring at the map on the wall. Red pins marked recovery locations from the past 5 years. Every pin except one. That absence lived in the northern section like a wound that wouldn't close. The place where his partner Marcus had walked into the trees 3 years ago and never walked out. The official report listed it as a fall. Equipment failure on a ravine traverse. Christopher had filed the paperwork himself, hands steady, eyes dry. He'd attended the memorial, accepted the condolences, continued working. Functional, professional, haunted. He loaded his pack with deliberate precision: GPS unit, extra batteries, first aid kit, emergency beacon, climbing rope, water filtration tablets, energy bars, thermal blanket, flares. The satellite phone went into the chest pocket of his jacket. 2014 technology, still more reliable than cell coverage in the deep forest. His fingers moved through the familiar ritual, but his mind kept circling back to Marcus's last transmission. "Chris, do you hear that? Someone's calling my name. Sounds just like my daughter." Marcus's daughter had been dead for 2 years at that point. Leukemia. Christopher shouldered the pack and walked out into the October morning. The parking lot held 3 other Ranger vehicles, their occupants preparing for the day's expanded search. He didn't join them. Instead, he drove west on the service road until the pavement gave way to gravel, then parked where the forest's edge began to blur into fog. The Hoh rainforest received over 370 centimeters of rain annually, creating an ecosystem found nowhere else in the continental United States. Sitka spruce and western hemlock towered above an understory so dense with ferns and moss that walking off trail meant wading through green darkness. The air itself felt thick, saturated, pressing against exposed skin like damp fabric. Christopher checked his compass, northeast, into Sector 7, and started walking. The forest swallowed sound differently here. In normal woods, noise faded gradually, absorbed by distance. Here it simply stopped, as if the moss-draped trees caught every vibration and held it. Christopher's boots made no sound on the cushioned earth. Even his breathing seemed muted, happening inside a smaller space than his lungs. He'd avoided this sector for 3 years. Convenient that other rangers needed the experience, that budget cuts required efficiency, that the trails here saw less traffic anyway. All true. All lies. The truth was simpler. He was afraid. 2 miles in, Christopher found the first sign. A purple ribbon tied to a branch, search and rescue markers from yesterday's grid. He photographed it with his phone's camera, noted the GPS coordinates, and kept moving. The official team had turned back here. The terrain grew difficult beyond this point, and department policy required teams to maintain visual contact with partners. Christopher had no partner, not anymore. The Douglas fir appeared gradually, the way significant things often did in fog. One moment, the forest looked uniformly dense. The next, he registered the massive trunk rising from the undergrowth like a cathedral pillar. 500 years old, maybe more, with a circumference that would require 6 people holding hands to encircle. The bark fissured deep enough to hide a fist inside the crevices. Marcus had been found 400 meters from this tree. The official report said equipment failure, but Christopher had examined the climbing rope himself afterward. The fibers hadn't frayed or weakened. They'd been cut cleanly by something sharp. He'd never mentioned that detail to anyone. Christopher approached the Douglas fir slowly, scanning the ground for disturbances. The moss grew thick here, undisturbed by foot traffic, but near the tree's base something caught his eye. A scrap of fabric, bright blue, snagged on a root. He crouched, carefully extracting it without touching it directly, sealing it in an evidence bag. The school group's permission slip had listed what Rachel wore: blue rain jacket, gray hiking boots, black backpack. "Rachel?" His voice fell flat in the dense air. "Rachel Morrison, if you can hear me, make a sound. Any sound." The forest gave back nothing. Not even the drip of water from leaves, though moisture hung visible in the air. Christopher straightened, turning in a slow circle. The GPS unit showed his exact position: 47.8597 degree N, 123.936 degree W, elevation 578 feet, but knowing where he stood didn't explain the sensation crawling up his spine, the feeling of being observed by something that didn't blink. He'd felt this before, 3 years ago, standing in almost this exact spot, calling Marcus's name. "I know you're here," Christopher said quietly. "I know what you are." The response came not as sound, but as absence. The already muted forest somehow grew more silent, the fog thickening until he couldn't see more than 30 feet in any direction. Temperature dropped. His breath suddenly visible, condensing in small clouds. Then, Christopher. His mother's voice. Exactly as he remembered it. Warm and slightly worried. The tone she'd used when he was 12 and stayed out past dark. His mother had been dead for 8 years. Christopher's hand went to the satellite phone, fingers closing around its solid weight. Real. Mechanical. Actual. Christopher, honey. I've been so worried. Come closer so I can see you. His feet wanted to move. Every instinct bred into him as a child responded to that voice, to the authority and love it carried. But Christopher had learned something in 3 years of avoiding this place, 3 years of carrying Marcus's death. Instinct could be weaponized. "You're not my mother," he said. The voice shifted, became Marcus. "Chris, man, I've been trying to reach you. I'm hurt. I can't move. Please, I need help." Marcus is dead. Another shift. Younger now, female. "Mr. Hayes? Is someone there? Mom? Mom, I heard you calling." "Rachel." Christopher's throat constricted. The voice sounded so real, so desperate. He forced himself to breathe, to think. The entity imitated voices, fed on emotional response. It had learned Marcus through his grief for his daughter. It had learned his mother through his unresolved loss. It had learned Rachel through her mother's desperate love. "Where is she?" Christopher demanded. "Where's Rachel Morrison?" The fog shifted, and for just a moment he saw a figure. Not clearly, more like a suggestion of human shape, standing near the base of the Douglas fir. Then it was gone. "Find me," Rachel's voice whispered, now coming from a different direction. "Please find me, it's so cold." Christopher moved, following the voice, GPS unit in one hand, flashlight in the other. The fog had grown so thick that the beam barely penetrated 3 feet ahead. His free hand trailed along tree trunks, maintaining orientation, counting steps. 50 meters northeast. The terrain sloped downward, and he felt rather than saw the ground falling away. A ravine, the one where Marcus had died. "I'm down here," Rachel's voice called from below. "I fell. I can't climb out." Christopher clicked on his headlamp, adding its light to the flashlight's beam. The ravine dropped 15 feet, its sides slick with moss and moisture. At the bottom, partially obscured by ferns, he saw bright blue fabric. Every protocol screamed at him to call for backup, to establish a safety line, to wait for the team. But 36 hours had passed. If Rachel was injured, hypothermic, every minute mattered. And somewhere deep in his gut, Christopher knew the entity wanted him to go down there, wanted him isolated, in the dark, in the cold, just like Marcus. He pulled out the satellite phone and hit the emergency beacon. The signal would bring the team eventually. Then he secured his rope to the nearest sturdy hemlock, tested the knot twice, and rappelled into the ravine. If this story is capturing your attention, follow for more quality content. What would you do in Christopher's situation? Share your thoughts. The bottom of the ravine existed in permanent twilight. The canopy above blocked 90% of available light, and the fog trapped what remained. Christopher's headlamp carved a small sphere of visibility in the gloom. The blue fabric resolved into Rachel's rain jacket, but it was empty. No body, no backpack, just the jacket, laid out almost ceremonially on a flat rock, arms spread. Christopher's pulse hammered in his ears. He swept the flashlight in a full circle, illuminating moss-covered walls, twisted roots, a small stream trickling over stones. No sign of the girl. No blood. No disturbance. "Behind you," Rachel's voice whispered. He spun. Nothing but rock and fern. "I'm so tired," the voice continued, now coming from above. "Tired of pretending. Tired of calling. Don't you want to rest, Christopher? Don't you want to stop running?" The voice wasn't Rachel's anymore. It shifted, became something older, stranger. Not male or female, but layered, as if multiple throats spoke in unison. Christopher backed against the ravine wall, rope still in his hand. His training had prepared him for bears, hypothermia, broken bones, not this. Not a thing that borrowed voices like masks. "What are you?" he asked. The fog in the ravine began to coalesce, forming shapes. Human figures, indistinct, standing motionless around him. 6, 7. More appearing at the edges of his vision. Some wore old clothing, others more recent. One wore a ranger uniform like his own. Marcus. Not actually Marcus. The face kept shifting, features sliding like melting wax, but wearing his shape, his posture, his badge number. "We're what grows in the listening places," the entity said through Marcus's approximated mouth. "We're what feeds on the space between call and answer. You know us, Christopher. You've felt us since you were a child in every dark room. Every moment you thought you heard your name." The figures stepped closer. Not walking, simply being nearer, as if distance was negotiable. "We don't kill," it continued. "We collect. Everyone who hears their name and follows. Everyone who wants so desperately to believe someone is calling them home." "Rachel," Christopher said, voice steady despite the terror crystallizing in his chest. "Where is Rachel Morrison?" "She's here. They're all here. In the tree, in the roots. Listening. Always listening." The Marcus shape pointed upward toward the Douglas fir visible at the ravine's edge. "Your partner understood in the end. He heard his daughter calling. He went to her so willingly. Such love, such beautiful, devastating love." Christopher's hand found the flare in his pocket. Standard emergency equipment. Magnesium core. Burns at 1900 degrees Fahrenheit for 60 seconds. He'd never considered using one as a weapon. "If you don't kill," he said slowly, "then Rachel's alive." Alive is such a limited concept. She's here. She's becoming. She's learning to call others home. Christopher pulled the flare's ignition cord. The magnesium burst into violent white light, so bright in the ravine's darkness that the entity's forms recoiled. The Marcus shape screamed, not with his partner's voice, but with something inhuman, a sound like wind through hollow trees. Christopher lunged for the rope, climbing. His shoulders burned with the effort, boots scrabbling for purchase on slick rock. Behind him the scream continued, joined by others, a chorus of stolen voices shrieking in rage and hunger. He hauled himself over the ravine's edge, rolled to his feet and ran. Not away from the forest toward the Douglas fir. If the entity collected people in the tree, kept them somehow, then Rachel might still be there, might still be findable. The fog tried to thicken around him to slow him, but the flare's light cut through it like a blade. Christopher reached the massive trunk and pressed his hand against the bark. Warm. The tree was warm, pulsing with a heat that had nothing to do with ambient temperature. He pulled out his knife and drove it into the bark. The forest screamed. Not the entity's voice, but the actual trees, a sound that vibrated through root systems and up through his legs, rattling his teeth. The fog convulsed. The ground beneath his feet shuddered. Christopher twisted the knife, prying away a section of bark as long as his forearm. Behind it, inside the tree, he saw pale shapes, faces, pressed against the inner wood like bodies trapped in ice, and one of them near the surface was moving. Rachel Morrison's face, recognizable from the school photo in the missing person report. Her eyes were open. Her mouth worked silently. Christopher dropped the knife and used both hands, tearing at the wood, ignoring the splinters driving into his palms. The tree fought back, bark trying to seal itself. But he was stronger, fueled by 3 years of guilt and rage. His fingers found fabric, then an arm, then he was pulling Rachel out of the tree itself. She came free with a wet, tearing sound collapsing against him. Her skin was cold, but her pulse beat steadily against his fingers when he checked her neck. Alive. Actually, alive. The fog entities surrounded them now, shapes solidifying into almost human forms. The Marcus thing stood closest, its face finally settling into his partner's true features. "You can't take her," it said. "She heard the call," she answered. "She belongs to us now." "No," Christopher said. He slung Rachel over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, her weight suddenly precious, real, savable. She belongs to her mother, and you don't get to have her. Then you stay. One for one, the forest feeds. It always feeds. Christopher looked at the thing wearing his dead partner's face. Thought about 3 years of nightmares, of avoiding this sector, of the rope with its 2 clean cuts. Marcus made a choice, he said quietly. He chose to follow a voice he knew was impossible. That was his grief talking, not yours. You didn't make him do anything. You just gave him permission. The entity tilted its head, curious. But I'm not making that choice, Christopher continued. And neither is she. He turned and walked away from the Douglas fir, carrying Rachel, moving as fast as the terrain allowed. The fog tried to confuse him, but the GPS unit in his pocket kept its steady count of coordinates. Behind him, the entities followed but didn't close the distance. They were testing him, waiting for him to stop, to listen, to hear his name in a voice he couldn't resist. Christopher kept walking, one foot in front of the other, Rachel's breathing steady against his back, the weight of her the only thing that mattered. When he finally saw flashlight beams cutting through the fog ahead, heard voices calling his name, real voices, radio distorted and worried, something in his chest loosened. "Here," he shouted. "I've got her." The search team materialized from the fog, and Christopher lowered Rachel carefully into a paramedic's waiting arms. She was hypothermic, dehydrated, her hands covered in shallow scratches, but alive. The team wrapped her in thermal blankets, started an IV, loaded her onto a stretcher. "How'd you find her?" one of the rangers asked. Christopher looked back toward the Douglas fir, now invisible in the fog. "I knew where to look," he said. That night, after the hospital confirmed Rachel would make a full recovery, after he'd filed the incident report and answered the questions, Christopher stood in the ranger station and stared at the map on the wall. The red pins marking recovery locations, the absence in Sector 7. He pulled a new pin from the drawer, green for successful recovery, and pressed it into the map at the coordinates of the Douglas fir. One pin. Not closure exactly, but acknowledgement. His phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Morrison. "Thank you for bringing my daughter home. She says you saved her life. She also says you should listen to your mother. She's worried about you working too hard." Christopher stared at the message, then deleted it. Rachel didn't remember being inside the tree. The doctors said hypothermia could cause hallucinations, false memories. The official report would list exposure and disorientation. Christopher wouldn't contradict it, but he'd seen her face pressed against the wood. He'd felt the tree's warmth. He'd heard the forest scream. And late at night, when the station was empty and the fog pressed against the windows, Christopher sometimes heard his mother's voice calling his name. Warm and worried, exactly as he remembered. He never answered. But he always listened, making sure no one else did either. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more engaging stories. What's your interpretation of what really happened in the Hoh rainforest? I'd love to read your theories in the comments. Christopher Hayes had spent 14 years coordinating search and rescue operations in the Pacific Northwest, and he'd learned to trust patterns. Patterns in weather systems, in hiker behavior, in the way people got lost. Patterns kept you alive in the wilderness. But the pattern spread across his desk in the SAR coordination office that October evening in 2008 was one he'd been trying not to see for months. 7 disappearances, 14 months, all within a 12-square-mile section of Olympic National Park's Quinault rainforest, all during the waning crescent moon. Christopher rubbed his eyes, the fluorescent lights of the ranger station buzzing overhead like trapped insects. Outside, the ancient Sitka spruces stood sentinel in the gathering darkness, their massive trunks disappearing into the perpetual mist that gave the temperate rainforest its otherworldly quality. He'd convinced himself the clustering was coincidental. Olympic received over 3 million visitors annually. People vanished in wilderness areas it happened. But Sarah Mitchell's disappearance 3 days ago had finally forced him to overlay all 7 cases on a single map, and now he couldn't unsee what the data screamed at him. They'd all vanished from the same area, a remote section of trail between Graves Creek and the Enchanted Valley, where the forest grew so dense that even at noon, the canopy reduced sunlight to a perpetual twilight. More disturbing were the details in the case files. Experienced hikers, all alone, all carrying proper gear and communication devices that simply stopped transmitting. No distress calls, no bodies, just gone. Sarah Mitchell had been the exception in one critical way. She'd managed to trigger her emergency beacon for exactly 47 seconds before it cut off. The last transmission placed her 3 miles off trail in a part of the forest so old and undisturbed that it wasn't on any modern map. Christopher had led the initial search himself, a 20-person team with dogs and thermal imaging. They'd found her pack at the base of a massive western red cedar, contents scattered as if she'd been interrupted mid-task. Her water bottle was open, half drunk. Her map was weighted down with stones, spread flat like she'd been studying it. But Sarah herself had simply evaporated. What the team had found, though, made Christopher's methodical mind stumble over itself, trying to rationalize. The tree, that ancient cedar, had marks carved into its bark. Not recent vandalism, but deep grooves that had been there for decades, maybe centuries, the bark growing around them in thick, gnarled patterns. The symbols meant nothing to Christopher, but their deliberate placement in a perfect circle around the tree's base suggested intentionality, ritual. Inside that circle, the ground was wrong. Not disturbed exactly, but compressed, as if something very heavy had rested there, pushing down on the moss and ferns with tremendous weight. Yet there were no tracks leading in or out, just that perfect circle of symbols and a space where something had been. Christopher had photographed everything, measured the compressed area, exactly 9 feet in diameter, documented the symbols. Then he'd ordered his team to expand the search radius, following protocol, being rational. But that night, back at the station, he'd made the mistake of pulling the files on the previous 6 disappearances. Each search had noted unusual findings. Strange marks on trees, areas where the forest seemed off in ways searchers struggled to articulate, malfunctioning equipment, GPS units spinning uselessly, radios filled with static that almost sounded like breathing, cameras capturing nothing but white light despite working perfectly hours before. More troubling were the incident reports he found buried in old files, testimonies from witnesses he'd never been shown. A hiker who claimed the last victim, a man named Marcus Webb, had been talking to the trees before wandering off trail. Another witness who'd seen victim number 3, Jennifer Sato, standing motionless in a clearing, watching something that wasn't there. These statements had been filed away, dismissed as unreliable. People saw what they expected to see in wilderness emergencies. Stress did things to perception, but 7 times. 7 witnesses describing victims acting strangely before vanishing in the same 12 square miles during the same lunar phase. Christopher pulled up the park's historical database going back decades. Olympic National Park had been established in 1938, but the land itself had belonged to the Quinault and Quileute peoples for thousands of years. The area where Sarah vanished, where all 7 had vanished, had a name in the old records: Scalep's Ground. The notation was brief, added by a ranger in 1952. Local Quinault elders request visitors avoid this area. Cultural significance. No further explanation, no follow-up. Just a polite suggestion that had been completely ignored by trail planners when they'd extended the Graves Creek trail system in the 1970s. Christopher wasn't superstitious. He'd grown up in Seattle, studied forestry and emergency management at University of Washington, spent his career dealing with the concrete realities of wilderness rescue. He believed in hypothermia and dehydration, in bear attacks and falls, in the 100 mundane ways the wilderness killed people. He did not believe in cultural taboos or sacred ground or forest spirits, but he was starting to believe in patterns. At 11 p.m. he drove home to his apartment in Quinault, stopping only to grab lukewarm coffee from the 24-hour gas station where the attendant, a Quinault man in his 60s named Joe Tallfeather, gave him a long look as he paid. "You're working the Mitchell case," Joe said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Do you know something?" Joe's weathered face was carefully neutral. "I know you should stop looking where you're looking. I have to find her. It's my job. Your job is to find people who can be found." Joe handed Christopher his change with deliberate slowness. "Some places in the forest, they're not for us anymore. Haven't been for a long time. Quinault elders tried to tell the Park Service back in the 40s, but nobody listens." Christopher felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Tell me about Scalep." The name hung between them. Joe's hand tightened on the counter. That word shouldn't be said out loud, especially not now, not during the dark moon. He glanced toward the windows where the forest pressed close against the gas station's harsh fluorescent bubble. "My grandmother told me stories. Said Scalep was a guardian, older than the tribes, older than the trees. When the first people came to this land, they made an agreement. They could hunt and gather and live in the forest, but certain places belonged to Scalep alone. Places where the barrier between worlds was thin. Go into those places without permission, without the proper rituals." Joe shook his head. "You don't come back. Or worse, something comes back wearing your face." "Joe, I appreciate the local history, but 7 people gone, Christopher. All in the same place. All during the dark of the moon when Scalep walks." Joe's eyes were hard now. "You've seen the signs, haven't you? The marks on the trees. That's a boundary. A warning. Those people crossed it." Christopher wanted to dismiss this as folklore, superstition, but his mind kept circling back to those symbols, that compressed ground, the uncanny consistency of 7 disappearances that followed no pattern he understood. "Even if I believed you, which I don't, I still have to search. Sarah Mitchell has a family. They deserve answers. Some answers cost more than you want to pay." Joe's voice dropped lower. "My grandmother said Scalep doesn't kill. It takes, claims what crosses into its territory, changes them, uses them. And during the dark moon, it's hungry for what we took from it. All these trails and lodges and tourists trampling through sacred ground like they own it." Christopher left without responding, but the conversation stayed with him. Back in his apartment, he couldn't sleep. Instead, he pulled out his laptop and started researching. The internet in 2008 was less comprehensive than it would become. But he found academic papers on Coast Salish mythology, references to territorial spirits, warnings about places where the forest became dangerous. Most of it was anthropological analysis, carefully academic and distant. But on an obscure forum dedicated to Pacific Northwest indigenous history, he found a scanned document, a report from 1941 by a Quinault elder named James Underwood, submitted to the National Park Service. The English was formal, careful. "The area designated as Quadrant 7C in your survey maps is known to our people as Skelep's ground. For as long as our stories remember, this place has been forbidden. It is where the spirit world and our world meet. Scalep is the guardian of that boundary, and it does not welcome human presence. We respectfully request that this area be excluded from public access." The Park Service's response, typed on official letterhead, "Thank you for your input. We find no evidence of dangerous wildlife or geological instability in the referenced area. Public access will proceed as planned." Christopher leaned back, staring at the screen. 70 years ago, the Quinault had warned them, and for 70 years, people had been disappearing. He tried to sleep but managed only a few hours of restless unconsciousness, filled with dreams of trees that watched with human eyes and ground that breathed. By 5 a.m., he was back at the station, pulling together a new search team. If there was a rational explanation, if Sarah Mitchell or any of the others were still alive out there, he had to find them. That's what his training demanded. That's what his conscience required. But as he loaded equipment into his truck, he found himself packing things that weren't standard SAR gear: salt, iron nails, a small bottle of cedar oil he'd found in his apartment's medicine cabinet from some half-remembered aromatherapy phase his ex-wife had gone through. Just in case, he told himself. Just to be thorough. The team of 8, all experienced search and rescue personnel, met at the Graves Creek trailhead at dawn. Christopher briefed them using only the official facts: missing hiker, last known position, standard grid search protocol. He didn't mention patterns or warnings or Quinault elders. That would make him sound unhinged, and he needed his team focused. They reached Sarah's last known position by 9 a.m., the site where they'd found her pack still marked with orange flags. Christopher deployed his team in pairs, maintaining radio contact on 15-minute check-ins. He took the westward vector himself, partnered with Emily Rodriguez, a wilderness EMT who'd been with the Park Service for 5 years. The forest here was different. Christopher had noticed it during the first search, but now, looking for it specifically, the wrongness was unmistakable. The trees grew denser, their trunks wider, their bark darker. The underbrush thinned to almost nothing, leaving clear sightlines between the massive trunks, sightlines that somehow showed nothing but more trees, deeper and deeper, as if the forest extended infinitely. The morning light, already dim under the canopy, seemed to weaken further, taking on a greenish tint that reminded Christopher of deep water. "Radio check," he called into his handset. "All teams report." Static answered him. Then faintly, "Team 2, position." More static, thick and wet sounding. "Team 2, repeat your position." The static resolved into something that might have been words in a language Christopher didn't recognize, a rhythmic chanting that made his teeth ache. Then it cut off completely. "Comms are fucked," Emily said, tapping her own radio. "I'm getting nothing." Christopher pulled out his GPS unit. The screen showed their position as a blinking cursor surrounded by nothing. No topographical data, no trail markers, just a blank screen except for that single pulsing light. He'd verified the unit was fully loaded with maps that morning. "Equipment malfunction," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Professional. We'll continue the search pattern and regroup at the primary marker in 2 hours." But as they pressed deeper into the forest, Christopher's carefully maintained rationality began to fracture. The trees here weren't just old, they were ancient, their trunks so massive that 3 people couldn't have encircled them with outstretched arms. More disturbing were the marks. Not just carved symbols anymore, but something else. Places where the bark had grown into shapes that resembled faces, hands, mouths frozen mid-scream. Natural formations, Christopher told himself. Pareidolia. The human brain finding patterns in randomness. Except the faces all looked the same. High cheekbones, hollow eyes, mouths open in identical expressions of terror. "Chris," Emily whispered. "Do you smell that?" He did. A sweet, rotten scent, like meat starting to turn, mixed with something else, cedar and earth and something indefinably wrong. The smell seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, growing stronger as they walked. They found the first marker 10 minutes later. Not a trail marker. Those had vanished as if they'd never existed. This was one of the carved symbols, fresh cut into a hemlock trunk, the wood still weeping sap. The symbol was crude but deliberate. A circle with radiating lines, like a child's drawing of a sun, except the lines bent at wrong angles, making Christopher's eyes hurt to follow them. "This wasn't here before," Emily said. "We would have seen it." Christopher reached out to touch the carving, and the moment his finger made contact with the sap, the world tilted. Just for a second, less than a second, but he was somewhere else, standing in the same spot. But the trees were smaller, younger, and there were people here, dressed in cedar bark and animal hide, chanting in that same rhythmic language he'd heard on the radio. They were drawing the symbols, cutting them deep, and they were afraid, terrified, creating a ward against something that moved through the trees, something tall and thin that didn't walk so much as flow, its body bending in ways no skeleton should allow. Then he was back, his finger on the sap, Emily staring at him with concern. "Chris, you okay? You zoned out for a second." "I'm fine," he lied. His heart was hammering. What the hell was that? Hallucination? His rational mind scrambled for explanations. Low blood sugar, stress, carbon monoxide from some unknown source. Not a vision. Definitely not a fucking vision of ancient indigenous people performing protective rituals against something that shouldn't exist. They continued searching, but Christopher's professional detachment was crumbling. Every few hundred feet they found more symbols, sometimes carved into trees, sometimes arranged in patterns on the ground using stones or bones, deer bones, bird bones, and once, horrifyingly, what looked like human finger bones arranged in a spiral. Emily wanted to call it in, but their radios remained dead. When Christopher checked his watch, the hands were spinning backward. "We need to head back," he said. "Regroup with the team." But finding their way back proved impossible. The forest had become a maze of identical massive trees in that sickly green light. Christopher's compass spun uselessly. His GPS remained blank. Even his sense of direction, honed by years of wilderness work, failed him completely. Every direction looked the same, and after 20 minutes of walking, they passed the same spiral of finger bones they'd seen before. "We're going in circles," Emily said, and Christopher heard the edge of panic in her voice. He was about to respond when he saw it. Movement between the trees, perhaps 50 yards ahead. Human-shaped but wrong, too tall and too thin, moving with a liquid grace that made his hindbrain scream danger. It was there for just a moment, then gone behind a massive cedar. "Sarah?" Emily called out. "Sarah Mitchell?" "Don't," Christopher said, grabbing her arm. Every instinct told him not to draw attention, not to call out, not to acknowledge what they'd seen, but Emily pulled free, moving toward where the figure had vanished. "Someone's out there. It could be her." Christopher followed, his hand dropping to the canister of bear spray on his belt. Useless, probably, against whatever they'd glimpsed, but holding it made him feel slightly less helpless. They rounded the cedar and stopped. The figure stood in a small clearing, its back to them. It was tall, easily 7 feet, wearing what looked like Sarah Mitchell's jacket. But the proportions were all wrong. The arms too long, hanging down past where knees should be. It stood perfectly still, and Christopher realized with mounting horror that it wasn't breathing, just standing there motionless as the trees around it. "Sarah?" Emily whispered. The figure turned, and Christopher's mind rebelled against what he saw. The jacket was Sarah's, yes, stained with mud and torn. But the thing wearing it wasn't human. Its skin was the color of old bark, gray-brown and deeply textured. Its face was an approximation of human features, eyes, nose, mouth, but stretched and flattened, like someone had pressed a human face into wet clay and then pulled it long. The eyes were solid black, no whites, no pupils, just depthless darkness that seemed to drink in the sickly light. It opened its mouth, and Sarah Mitchell's voice came out. "Help me. Please. I'm lost." The voice was perfect, exactly right, but the mouth didn't move correctly, the lips forming shapes that didn't match the sounds. Emily took a step forward, and Christopher grabbed her again, harder this time. "That's not her," he said. The thing's head tilted, and more words came in Sarah's voice. "It's me. I'm scared. Please help me." But even as it spoke, its body was changing, the jacket sliding off as its skin rippled and shifted, arms lengthening further, fingers extending into something more like branches than digits. "Run," Christopher said. They ran, through the trees, over fallen logs, dodging between massive trunks while behind them came sounds that weren't quite footsteps, more like something large dragging itself across the forest floor. Christopher didn't look back. Looking back would mean seeing it clearly, and he knew instinctively that seeing it clearly would break something fundamental in his mind. They burst through a curtain of hanging moss into another clearing, and Christopher skidded to a stop. The clearing was ringed with the symbol-carved trees, forming a perfect circle about 30 feet across. Inside that circle, the ground was wrong, compressed, just like the area where they'd found Sarah's pack. But this depression was deeper, older, and at its center stood a structure. No, not a structure, an arrangement. Bones, human bones, arranged in a spiral pattern, ascending upward in a helix that defied physics, bones hovering in place with nothing supporting them, rotating slowly. Christopher counted 6 skulls in the spiral, and his professional detachment finally shattered completely as he recognized the fifth skull by its distinctive dental work. Marcus Webb, missing 14 months. "Oh God," Emily breathed. "Oh God, oh God, oh." The sound behind them had stopped. Christopher turned slowly, already knowing what he'd see. The thing that wore Sarah Mitchell's jacket stood at the edge of the clearing, just outside the ring of carved trees. It made no move to enter. Instead, it watched them with those bottomless black eyes, and as Christopher met its gaze, he felt something slither through his mind. Not thoughts exactly, but impressions, ancient and vast and utterly inhuman. Territory, boundary, violation, price. The thing raised one too long arm and pointed at them, then at the spiral of bones, then back at them. The meaning was clear. You crossed. You owe. You become. "The symbols," Christopher said, his voice cracking. "The circles. They're not decorations, they're boundaries, warnings." He looked around the clearing at the ring of marked trees. "We're inside its territory. We've been inside it since when? Since they'd found Sarah's pack? Since they'd entered the forest?" He didn't know anymore. The thing stepped forward, and impossibly it spoke with a voice that wasn't Sarah's or anyone's, a voice that sounded like wind through hollow trees. 7 crossed, 7 taken. The debt grows, the agreement breaks, the boundary fails. Christopher's mind raced. Agreement. The Quinault Elder's warning. "You're Skilep," he said. "The Guardian." The thing's approximation of a face shifted, pleased or amused or neither. Christopher couldn't tell. "Guardian, Watcher, Keeper of the Thin Place. For 1,000 generations I held the boundary. But your people, they do not see, do not respect. They cut trails through my territory. They camp where the worlds meet. They take and give nothing. The disappearances," Emily said, her voice small. "You took them. They entered. They owed." The creature gestured at the bone spiral. "Now they serve. They watch with me. They become boundary, as you will become." Christopher forced himself to think through the terror. Patterns. There was always a pattern. 7 people in 14 months, all during the waning crescent. Why then? When the moon dies, the barrier thins. I can reach further, can claim what crosses. The thing that had been Sarah stepped closer, now just outside the carved ring. But 7 is not enough. The debt is centuries deep. I need more eyes, more hands, more watchers. That's when Christopher understood. The disappearances weren't random predation. They were recruitment, transformation. Skilep wasn't just guarding the boundary. It was creating more guardians, forcing humans to become what it needed them to be. The bone spirals weren't displays. They were anchors, binding the transformed victims to this place forever. "There has to be another way," Christopher said. "The original agreement, what if we honored it? Closed this area to visitors, made it sacred ground again?" The creature's laugh was the sound of breaking branches. "Words. Your people make promises of wind. Already you have taken too much, changed too much. The barrier cracks wider every season. Soon I will not be able to hold what presses from the other side." It gestured at the darkness between the trees, and Christopher saw with mounting horror that the shadows there were moving, writhing with shapes that had too many limbs and not enough form. "So I take what I need. I make more watchers. Or everything here becomes like the other side, twisted, hungry, endless." Christopher's trained mind, the part that analyzed emergency situations and found solutions, was screaming at him. This was a hostage scenario. Negotiation was possible. Then negotiate with us. With the tribes, with the Park Service, there has to be. "I do not negotiate," Skilep said. "I am. You crossed. You owe. You become." It lunged forward, and Christopher realized his mistake. The carved boundary wasn't keeping Skilep out, it was keeping them in. This was a trap, a processing area where the transformation happened. Emily screamed as the creature's hand, no longer even remotely human, just branches ending in thorns, wrapped around her arm. Christopher grabbed the canister of bear spray and emptied it directly into the creature's approximation of a face. The spray passed through it like mist through smoke, having no effect. Desperate, Christopher remembered the items he'd packed that morning. Salt, iron nails, things from half-remembered folklore that his rational mind had dismissed. He fumbled for the iron nails, scattering them across the compressed ground. The effect was immediate. Where the nails touched the earth, the ground itself recoiled, the compressed area rippling like disturbed water. Scalep released Emily with a sound like tearing wood, its form flickering between the thing wearing Sarah's jacket and something older, more primal, a pillar of twisted organic matter that was part tree, part flesh, part shadow. Iron, it hissed. The old ways. You know the old ways? Christopher didn't. Not really. But he poured out the salt in a line between them and the creature, completing some instinctive pattern. Let us go. We'll make sure no one else comes here. We'll honor the boundary. Promises, Scalep said, but it had retreated to the edge of the clearing, its form still flickering. Your kind has made promises before. Then what do you want? Christopher demanded. You said the barrier is failing. Turning us into more guardians isn't fixing that. It's just adding bodies to a losing battle. The creature was silent for a long moment, and Christopher sensed he'd struck something important. The barrier needs both sides, Scalep finally said. Your world and the other, held separate, but your world forgets, doesn't believe. The forgetting weakens everything. Understanding crashed over Christopher. You need believers, people who know you're real, who respect the boundary, not prisoners. Not slaves. Allies. Allies. The word seemed strange in Scalep's mouth. For 1,000 generations there were allies. The first people who remembered, who taught their children, who walked carefully. Its gaze fixed on Christopher with terrible intensity. But you make maps and trails and pretend the old places don't exist. Until people wander in unprepared and I must choose. Let them disturb what must not be disturbed, or take them. Then let us prepare them. Christopher said, let us tell the story, warn people. Close this area officially, not just on forgotten maps, but for real. Who would listen? Who would believe? I would, Christopher said. I will, and I'll make others listen. Emily, still shaking, nodded. The tribes were right. All along they were right. We'll help them be heard. Scalep regarded them for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. 7 I have taken. 7 who crossed unprepared, unbelieving. You two have crossed, but you see now. You believe. Its form solidified somewhat, becoming more human-shaped, though still wrong in fundamental ways. Go. Tell your people what you have seen. Make them understand that some boundaries exist for reasons older than your laws. If you succeed, if the forgetting ends and the respect returns, I will release the 7. If you fail... If we fail? Christopher asked. Then the barrier breaks completely, and what has been held back for millennia will finally push through. And I will need an army of watchers, not just 7. The creature gestured, and suddenly the forest seemed to rotate around them. Christopher felt dizzy, disoriented, and then... They were standing at the Graves Creek trailhead. Their entire team was there, looking worried but unharmed. According to their watches, only 40 minutes had passed, though it had felt like hours in that clearing. Christopher's radio crackled to life with normal chatter about search sectors and grid patterns. Everything seemed normal, except Christopher could still smell that sweet rotten scent, and when he looked down, there was bark growing under his fingernails. Emily's eyes had flecks of solid black in them that hadn't been there before. They weren't fully transformed, but they'd been touched, marked, changed enough to remember, to believe, to serve as living warnings. Christopher spent the next 6 months fighting through bureaucracy, speaking with Kinol elders who were initially suspicious, but eventually willing to work with him, submitting reports that were dismissed as stress-induced delusions, until he brought in the testimony of Joe Tallfeather and a dozen other indigenous voices that could no longer be ignored. The section of forest was finally, officially, designated as culturally restricted land. No public access, no trails. The boundaries marked clearly with signs in both English and Lushootseed. Sacred ground. No entry. Sarah Mitchell and the other 6 were officially declared dead after the standard waiting period. Their bodies were never found. But on certain nights, Christopher drove out to the boundary markers and could swear he saw figures moving between the distant trees. Tall, thin figures that watched the boundary, keeping it secure. He kept his promise. He told the story, over and over, to anyone who would listen. Some believed, most didn't. But enough people knew now that the area remained closed, and the disappearances stopped. Christopher never entered that section of forest again, though he walked its boundaries regularly. The bark under his fingernails never fully went away, a permanent reminder of what he'd seen, what he'd promised. Emily left the Park Service 6 months later. Unable to bear being so close to that place, she called Christopher once, a year after the incident, her voice tight with suppressed terror. "I saw them in my dreams last night, the 7. They thanked me, said the boundary was holding, that what we did mattered." Christopher had had the same dream. He stood at the boundary marker now 10 years later in 2018, watching the forest that held secrets older than nations. His rational mind had never fully recovered from what he'd experienced, but he'd learned to live with the knowledge that rationality had limits. Some things existed beyond data and patterns and logical explanations. Some boundaries needed to be respected, even if you couldn't measure or quantify or understand them. From deep in the restricted forest, he heard a sound, rhythmic, like chanting, like the voices he'd heard on that static-filled radio so long ago. Watchful, ancient, endless, the barrier was holding. For now. Because he'd kept his promise. Because he'd made people remember. But on nights like this, when the moon waned toward darkness, Christopher wondered how long memory lasted, how long promises endured, how long it would be before someone forgot again and decided that boundaries were just suggestions. He touched the bark growing under his nails and turned away from the forest, carrying his terror and his knowledge like weights he could never put down, walking the razor edge between worlds that most people didn't even know existed. The forest watched him go. The forest always watched. If this story gave you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Christopher's place? Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? The call came through at 2:47 p.m., crackling over Dan Mitchell's Motorola radio as he marked coordinates on a trail maintenance report. The dispatcher's voice carried that particular tension he'd learned to recognize, the kind that meant someone's world was collapsing in real time. "Ranger Mitchell, we've got a distraught family member on the line. Transfer in 5 seconds." Dan set down his pencil. Through the ranger station window, Douglas firs swayed against an October sky the color of old pewter. He pressed the receiver to his ear and heard a woman's voice, high and breaking. "Please, you have to find her. It's been 36 hours. Sophia wouldn't just disappear. She's responsible. She checks in every day, and now..." The words tumbled out in a rush of controlled panic. "Ma'am, I need you to slow down. Tell me your daughter's name." "Sophia. Sophia Chen. She's a graduate student at UW, doing field research on mycorrhizal networks. She's been staying at the Ho research station since last Monday, and she hasn't answered her satellite phone since Monday night. The university tried reaching her yesterday, and when she didn't respond, they called me this morning. I've been trying everyone, and nobody will tell me anything useful." Dan opened his incident log, pen hovering over blank paper. The Ho research station. His hand paused, a tremor running through his fingers that had nothing to do with the temperature. The station sat 12 miles into the Ho rainforest, accessible only by a service road that had been washed out last winter. Most rangers avoided it when they could. "Mr. Mitchell, are you there?" "Yes, I'm here. Has anyone been out to the station?" They said something about limited resources, about waiting to see if she checked in. But it's been 36 hours. She could be hurt. She could be... Mrs. Chen's voice cracked. Please. You're my last call before I drive up there myself. Dan closed his eyes. 3 years ago, almost to the day, he'd responded to a similar call. A missing hiker named Kevin Valdez, last seen on the Sol Duque River Trail. Dan and his partner, Marcus Reed, had found Kevin's campsite intact, his pack untouched, his boots still by the tent. But Kevin himself had vanished into the dense understory like smoke. They'd searched for 2 weeks. Dan had been the one to hear Marcus's voice calling from somewhere deep in the woods on the 13th night. Except Marcus had been standing right next to him, equally confused. The next morning, they'd found Marcus's body at the bottom of a ravine, a quarter-mile from where they'd been standing. The official report said Marcus had wandered off alone and fallen, but Dan knew what he'd heard. Someone, something, had called out in Marcus's exact voice. "Mr. Mitchell?" "I'll head out there within the hour," Dan heard himself say. "Give me your contact information." After Mrs. Chen hung up, Dan sat motionless at his desk. His supervisor, Linda Hernandez, appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "You don't have to take this one, Dan. I can send Patterson." "Patterson doesn't know the whole interior." "Neither do you, not anymore. You haven't been out that way since—" "I know the trails." Dan stood, reaching for his pack. "I'll radio in every 2 hours." Linda studied him with the careful expression of someone watching a man walk toward a cliff edge. "Take the satellite phone, the new one, not the old Garmin. And Dan, if anything feels off, you come back, immediately." Dan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He loaded his pack with methodical precision. First aid kit, emergency rations, water purification tablets, headlamp with extra batteries, his personal Garmin eTrex GPS unit, topographic maps sealed in waterproof bags, rope, signal flares. The satellite phone went into the top pocket, though reception was spotty at best under the rainforest canopy. He signed out a Ford Ranger from the motor pool and drove west on Route 101, watching the landscape shift from second-growth timber to old-growth giants. The air grew heavier, thick with moisture that never quite became rain, but never fully lifted either. By the time he turned onto the service road leading to the Ho Research Station, the forest had closed in completely, turning afternoon into premature twilight. The road had deteriorated further since his last visit. Moss consumed everything here: the pavement, the fallen logs, the rusted guardrails. Dan navigated around a washout, his truck lurching through muddy ruts. The radio hissed static. He tried raising dispatch but got only electromagnetic noise. The research station appeared through the trees like a fossil from another era, a collection of weathered buildings surrounding a central lodge built in the 1960s. Solar panels on the roof, a propane tank out back, windows dark. Dan parked beside a silver Subaru with a University of Washington parking permit in the window. Sophia's car. He cut the engine. The silence that followed felt weighted, expectant. Rain had begun to fall, not drops, but a fine mist that seemed to materialize directly from the air. Dan grabbed his pack and approached the main lodge, boots squelching in decomposing needles. "Sophia Chen, Forest Service." His voice vanished into the trees without echo. The lodge door hung ajar. Dan pushed it open with his boot, hand on his flashlight. Inside, the smell of old wood and mildew. A kitchenette to the left, a common area with mismatched furniture, a hallway leading to what he assumed were sleeping quarters. Papers covered a central table, research notes, specimen labels, photographs of fungal structures magnified to alien geometries. Sophia's laptop sat closed beside a half-empty mug of coffee. Dan touched the mug. Stone cold. A charging cable snaked across the table to a portable battery pack, dead. "Sophia, it's Ranger Mitchell. Your mother asked me to check on you." Nothing. He moved down the hallway, checking rooms. The first 2 were empty, beds stripped to bare mattresses. The third showed signs of habitation: a sleeping bag spread over institutional sheets, a backpack in the corner. Clothing hung neatly over a chair. A photograph pinned to the wall showed a young Asian woman with her arm around an older woman who had to be Mrs. Chen. Same sharp cheekbones, same determined set to the jaw. Dan returned to the common area and examined Sophia's research materials more carefully. Her field notes were meticulous, tracking collection sites across a 5-square-mile area. The most recent entry was dated Monday, October 13th, 2 days ago, and described a significant fruiting event near a location she'd labeled Site 7 Old Growth Cluster. A hand-drawn map showed the site's location, approximately 2 miles northwest of the station, following what Sophia had marked as Deer Run Trail. Dan cross-referenced it with his topographic map. The trail existed, barely, an unmaintained path that disappeared into some of the densest old-growth forest in the continental United States. He checked his watch, 4:15 p.m. Maybe 3 hours of workable light left, less under the canopy. The smart move would be to radio for additional personnel, establish a proper search grid, wait for morning. But he thought of Mrs. Chen's voice, the particular pitch of a parent's terror, and found himself walking toward the tree line, mid-story CTA. If this story is capturing your attention, follow for more quality content. What would you do in Dan's situation? Wait for backup or push forward? Share your thoughts below. The trail began as a suggestion more than a path, marked only by slight gaps in the undergrowth. Dan activated his GPS unit, logging his route. The device showed his position as a blue dot in a sea of green. Though he knew from experience how quickly the rainforest could scramble electronic equipment, the mist had evolved into proper rain now, a steady percussion against the canopy high above. He moved carefully, scanning for signs of recent passage. The forest floor here was a living thing, not earth, but centuries of decomposition layered into a springy substrate that absorbed footprints like memory foam. Still, Sophia would have left traces. Broken ferns, displaced nurse logs, something. After 20 minutes, he found it. A small orange flag tied to a hemlock branch at eye level, then another, 10 yards ahead. Sophia's trail markers. Dan felt a small loosening in his chest. At least she'd been thinking about finding her way back. The flags led him deeper into the ancient growth. These trees predated Columbus. Some of them predated the Roman Empire. Their trunks rose like cathedral pillars, 40 feet in circumference, vanishing into a canopy so thick that the rain became a whisper by the time it reached the forest floor. Nurse logs larger than city buses lay decomposing, supporting entire ecosystems on their backs. Everything grew on everything else here. Ferns sprouted from moss that covered trees that grew from fallen giants. Dan had forgotten how completely the hoe could swallow you, how the air itself seemed alive, moving through the understory with slow intelligence, how sounds behaved strangely, sometimes carrying from impossible distances, other times dying inches from their source. He found Site 7 as daylight began its final fade. Sophia had chosen well, a cluster of ancient Sitka spruces arranged in a rough circle, their roots interlaced like knotted fingers. Mushrooms erupted everywhere, chanterelles like orange flames, shelf fungi cascading down trunks in layers of white and brown, strange bulbous growths Dan couldn't identify. In the center of the clearing, someone had arranged a collection kit and measurement tools with scientific precision. But no Sophia. Dan circled the site, looking for signs of struggle, distress, anything. He found only more orange flags, these ones leading away from the clearing along a bearing that made no sense according to Sophia's map. She'd been heading back toward the station when she'd marked the trail. Why would she suddenly veer north deeper into the interior? Sophia? His voice sounded muffled, absorbed by the moss. Sophia Chen, if you can hear me, I'm here to help. Your mother sent me. A response came, but not from any direction he could pin down. At first he thought it was a bird, some species he didn't recognize. Then he realized it was his name. Dan. Not Ranger Mitchell or Officer. His first name, spoken in a voice that carried an odd resonance like someone speaking through a long pipe. Every muscle in Dan's body went rigid. He spun slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing but trunks and shadows and the endless rain. Who's there? Dan. The voice came from behind him now. He wheeled around, hand dropping to the canister of bear spray on his belt. Still nothing visible. Just the ancient spruces and their patient silence. His heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening again. He pulled out his radio, thumbed the transmit button. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Mitchell. I'm at the research site. I need to report." Static roared in his ear, so loud he yanked the receiver away. When the noise subsided, he tried again. Dead air. The radio's battery indicator showed full charge, but the device might as well have been a brick of plastic. "Dan." The voice again, closer now. And there was something wrong with it. Something he couldn't quite articulate. It sounded like his name being spoken underwater or through a mouth that wasn't quite the right shape for human speech. He pulled out his flashlight and swept the beam across the clearing. The light caught something at the edge of the circle, a shape that didn't belong. Dan moved toward it, keeping his beam steady. It was a boot. Sophia's boot, based on the size. Just the one, lying on its side near the base of a spruce, laces still tied. Dan knelt beside it, pulse throbbing in his temples. The boot showed no signs of damage, no blood, no indication of how it had been removed. It simply sat there, as if Sophia had stepped out of it mid-stride and kept walking. Looking for something? Dan jerked upright, spinning toward the voice. This time it had sounded almost normal, almost like a real person speaking from somewhere in the trees. The beam of his flashlight caught nothing but bark and moss and the slow drift of rain. "Sophia? Is that you? Does it sound like Sophia?" The voice had changed again, taking on a mocking quality. Or maybe not mocking, maybe curious, the way a child might ask a question while pulling wings off an insect. Dan backed toward the center of the clearing, keeping his light moving. His rational mind offered explanations. Other hikers, echo effects in the dense forest, auditory hallucinations from stress and lack of sleep. His body knew better. His body remembered standing in these same woods 3 years ago, hearing Marcus's voice calling his name while Marcus stood 5 feet away. "What are you?" The question came out steadier than he felt. "We've been here longer than your words." The voice seemed to come from everywhere now, from the trees, from the ground, from inside his own skull. "We were here when the first people walked under these branches. We were here when the ice came and went. We'll be here when the last tree falls and begins its long rot back into Earth." Dan's hand found the satellite phone in his pack. His fingers fumbled with the power button, trying not to think about how Marcus had called for help on his radio right up until the moment the thing, whatever it was, had led him off that ravine edge. The phone's screen flickered to life, showing a faint signal. Dan pressed the emergency beacon, hoping it would punch through to the repeater on Mount Olympus. The screen showed the transmission attempt, a small icon spinning. "Communication." The voice sounded pleased. "We remember communication. The ones who came before you tried to speak with us. They brought their iron symbols and their promises. They thought they could contain us with ritual and prayer." Dan risked a glance at the phone. Still transmitting. "Keep it talking. Keep it distracted." "The colonists? The ones who died here in 1892? Died." The word came out like a taste being tested. "That's what you call it. They called it sacrifice. They thought feeding us would satisfy the hunger. They learned otherwise." The phone's screen went black. Dan pressed the power button. Nothing. The device was dead, drained of battery despite showing 90% charge 30 seconds earlier. "You have trauma." The voice had shifted again, taking on an almost gentle quality. "We can taste it on you. That one you lost, the one who heard us calling. He had trauma too. Old fears from childhood, wounds that never healed. We fed on those first, made them larger, turned them into hooks we could pull." Dan's breath came short and sharp. He forced himself to think through the panic. This thing, whatever it was, fed on fear and pain. It had done something to Marcus, and now it had done something to Sophia. But what did it want? Why the conversation? Why not simply take him the way it had taken the others? "Where's Sophia?" "Sophia." The voice elongated the syllables, savoring them. "The one who studies connections. The one who came to understand how everything feeds on everything else in this place. how nothing stands alone, how all boundaries are illusion. Is she alive? Alive. Dead. These are concepts from your small understanding. Something moved in the shadows beyond Dan's light. Not one thing, but many. Shapes that might have been branches swaying, except there was no wind. She's here. She's been here since she understood what we offered. A choice, Daniel Mitchell. The same choice we offer to all who come this far into our home. Dan's back hit one of the ancient spruces. The bark felt unnaturally warm against his shoulders, as if the tree itself had fever. What choice? To feed or be fed upon. To join the network or be consumed by it. Your partner chose to run. Sophia chose something else. The shapes resolved themselves into something almost human. Tall figures made of shadow and moss and the negative space between trees. They moved with fluid grace surrounding the clearing but not entering it. Dan counted 4, then 6, then lost track as they seemed to multiply or merge or slip from one position to another without crossing the intervening distance. 3 years ago, Dan said, his voice barely above a whisper, you called out in Marcus's voice. You led him away from me. We called in many voices. His mother's voice, his daughter's voice, the voice of the God he'd stopped believing in. He ran from all of them. He ran so hard he forgot to watch where he was going. Dan's hand closed around the flare in his pack. Useless as a weapon, but maybe enough light to break whatever illusion this was. Maybe enough to run. But you, the voice continued, you came back, despite the trauma, despite the fear, because a mother begged you, because you still believe you can save someone. Where is she? Dan thumbed the flare's cap, ready to strike. She's where she chose to be. Would you like to see? One of the shadow figures stepped forward into the clearing, and Dan saw it wasn't a shadow at all. It was Sophia Chen, or something wearing Sophia Chen, like an ill-fitting coat. Her skin had taken on a greenish cast, and her eyes reflected his flashlight beam the way an animal's eyes might. She wore only one boot. Mr. Mitchell. Sophia's voice, but with that same underwater quality he'd heard before. Thank you for coming. My mother worries too much. Dan's finger tightened on the flare striker, but he didn't pull it. Because Sophia, this thing that looked like Sophia, was smiling. Not the rictus grin of a corpse or the blank expression of someone under duress. An actual smile, serene and knowing. What did they do to you? Showed me. Sophia spread her arms wide, encompassing the forest. Everything here is connected, Mr. Mitchell. Every tree, every fungus, every particle of decay. There's a network older than human consciousness, older than language. It thinks. It remembers. It feeds. You're not Sophia. I'm more Sophia than I was 2 days ago. I'm also more than Sophia. The boundaries dissolved. Do you know what that feels like? To suddenly understand that the self you've been protecting your whole life is just an arbitrary line drawn in water? Dan pulled the flare striker. Chemical light erupted in a cascade of red, driving back the darkness. The shadow figures recoiled, and for an instant Dan saw them clearly. Not creatures, but spaces where the forest had bent itself into almost human shapes. Sophia staggered backward, raising an arm to shield her eyes. He ran. The forest became a blur of wet bark and grasping branches. Dan's flashlight beam jerked wildly as he crashed through undergrowth, following no trail, driven only by blind panic. Behind him he heard laughter, not menacing but genuinely amused, like a parent watching a child's tantrum. Running, just like the other one, the voice called after him. Running from understanding. Running from truth. A branch caught Dan across the face, drawing blood. He stumbled, caught himself against a tree, kept going. His GPS unit showed his position drifting across the screen but offered no guidance. The map had become meaningless. Every direction looked the same. Every tree trunk identical to the last. He burst through a wall of ferns and found himself back in the clearing with the ancient spruces. Impossible. He'd been running for 5 minutes at least, moving in what should have been a straight line away from this place. But here it was again, the mushroom-studded earth. Sophia's measurement tools, the single abandoned boot. Space is flexible here, the voice explained patiently. You're in our territory now. The geometry follows different rules. Dan sank to his knees, flashlight beam pointing at nothing. The flare had burned out. His pack suddenly weighed 100 pounds. 3 years of guilt and fear and sleepless nights came crashing down on him all at once, and he understood with perfect clarity that he was going to die in this forest. Just like Marcus, just like the colonists in 1892, just like however many others had wandered too far into the Ho and learned that some places existed outside the boundaries of the rational world. There it is. The voice sounded satisfied. The trauma, the wound that never healed. You blame yourself for his death. You think if you'd been faster, smarter, braver, you could have saved him. Yes. The word came out as a sob. Yes, I could have. No. Sophia emerged from the trees again, kneeling beside him. Her hand on his shoulder felt cold and damp like moss. You couldn't have. No one could have. Marcus was ours from the moment he heard us call. His fear was too big, too old. It had roots that went down to bedrock. And what about you? Dan raised his head to look at her. What roots did you have? Curiosity, the need to understand. When I realized what lived in this forest, what had been here all along beneath the veneer of scientific explanation, I wanted to know more. She smiled again, that unsettling serenity. They offered me a choice. Keep the illusion of separation or dissolve into something larger. I chose dissolution. That's not a choice. That's predation dressed up as enlightenment. Is it? Sophia tilted her head, bird-like. What's the difference between predation and transformation? When a caterpillar dissolves inside its chrysalis, every cell breaking down into undifferentiated soup before reforming as a butterfly, is that death or metamorphosis? Dan's hand went to his pack, searching for anything useful. His fingers found the emergency beacon, a small device he'd forgotten about. It operated on a different frequency than the satellite phone, designed to transmit a location signal that Forest Service helicopters could track. He pressed the activation button, holding it down until he felt the device vibrate once in confirmation. Calling for help. The voice didn't sound concerned. They won't find you. The canopy is too thick for aerial search, and even if they come on foot, we'll lead them astray. We're very good at that. Dan stood on shaking legs. He faced the shapes circling the clearing, more of them now, dozens maybe, the forest itself taking on humanoid form. When he spoke, his voice had found steadiness from somewhere. Here's what I understand. You feed on people who come into your territory. You manipulate them, scare them, break them down until they either run themselves to death or give up and let you take them. That's not transformation. That's parasitism. And I'm not Marcus. No, the voice agreed. You're not. You're more damaged, more guilty, more delicious. I'm also more stubborn. Dan pulled out his topographic map and his compass, checking the bearing despite knowing it was probably useless. Marcus was a good man, but he was always afraid of disappointing people, afraid of being weak. That's what you used against him, that fear of his own fear. He started walking, picking a direction at random and committing to it. The shadow figures moved to block his path, but he walked through them. They felt like cold vapor, resistant but not solid. My fear isn't weakness, Dan continued, still walking. My fear is letting someone else die because I gave up, and that means I don't get to quit. I don't get to dissolve into your network or run screaming into a ravine. I have to keep trying, no matter how pointless it seems, because that's who I chose to be after Marcus died. The forest seemed to contract around him, trees leaning in, the canopy pressing down. Sophia appeared directly in his path, her expression no longer serene but something else. Frustrated, confused. You're choosing suffering, she said. Pain and guilt and decades of regret. Why? What's the point of protecting an identity that causes nothing but anguish? Because it's mine. Dan stepped around her. Because I'm a person, not a process. And if that means carrying this guilt until it kills me, that's still better than surrendering everything that makes me who I am. The resistance increased. Branches seemed to actively grab at his clothing now. The ground turned boggy, trying to slow his progress. The voices multiplied, calling to him in dozens of registers. His mother, his ex-wife, Marcus, people he'd loved and lost and failed. He kept walking. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had become as fluid as space. Dan's legs burned with exhaustion. His clothes were soaked through. Blood trickled from a dozen small cuts where branches had scored his face and hands. But he kept moving forward, following the compass bearing he'd chosen, refusing to deviate no matter what the forest threw at him. And slowly, incrementally, the pressure began to ease. The voices faded to whispers. The shadow figures receded into the tree line. The forest resumed its normal density, still ancient, still powerful, but no longer actively hostile. Dan checked his GPS and found, impossibly, that he'd traveled almost a mile northwest, toward the old logging road that ran along the northern boundary of the research area. Dawn was breaking as he stumbled out of the tree line onto cracked pavement. The sky had cleared during the night, leaving the world washed clean. Dan stood on the road for a long moment, just breathing, confirming that he still existed as a discrete entity, separate from the forest. His radio crackled to life. "Gur Mitchell, if you can hear this, respond. Search teams are converging on your last known position. Ranger Mitchell, please respond." Dan pressed the transmit button. "This is Mitchell. I'm on the northern access road, approximately 2 miles from the research station. I'm mobile but need immediate evacuation." The relief in the dispatcher's voice was audible. "Copy that, Mitchell. Stay on the road. We have your beacon signal. Help is 15 minutes out." Dan sank down onto the pavement back against a tree. As he waited, he thought about Sophia Chen, or whatever remained of her in that clearing. She'd made a choice, though whether it had been a genuine choice or just an elaborate form of coercion, he couldn't say. He thought about Marcus running through these same woods, hearing the same impossible voices, making his own choice in a moment of terror. And he thought about himself, the choice he'd made to keep walking even when everything inside him screamed to stop. Whether that made him brave or just too damaged to know better, he couldn't say. The helicopter arrived 14 minutes later, its rotors beating the air into submission. As Dan climbed into the rescue basket, he looked back at the forest. For just an instant, he thought he saw figures standing at the tree line. Tall shapes that might have been moss-covered trunks or might have been something else, watching him leave. He didn't look away. He met their gaze, if that's what it was, and held it until the helicopter lifted him above the canopy. End story, CTA. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more compelling stories. What's your interpretation of Sophia's fate? Was she truly transformed or consumed? I'd love to read your theories in the comments. Epilogue. The official report stated that Sophia Chen remained missing, presumed lost to the hazards of backcountry wilderness. Her research notes were recovered from the lodge and forwarded to the University of Washington. The site she'd labeled Site 7 was not included in the search grid. Dan's GPS log showed no record of ever visiting that location, though he insisted otherwise. Mrs. Chen called Dan 3 times over the following months. He told her the truth as he understood it, that her daughter had gone into the forest and chosen not to come back. Mrs. Chen stopped calling after that. Dan resigned from the Forest Service in January 2009. He took a job as a ranger naturalist in Yellowstone, about as far from the rainforests of the Olympic Peninsula as one could get while staying on the continental United States. He never went back to the Ho, but sometimes, on quiet nights, he thought he heard voices calling his name from the darkness beyond his cabin. And sometimes, he wondered if the thing in the forest had been lying about choice, about transformation, about the boundaries between self and other. And sometimes he knew it hadn't been lying at all, which was somehow worse. Tentar novamente.